episode of Progress, Potential, and Possibilities, discussions with fascinating people designing a better tomorrow for all of us. I'm your host, Ira Pastor. Welcome, everybody, again to another episode of our show, bringing you another really fascinating guest today who is helping to create a better tomorrow for all of us on many very unique fronts. We have the honor today of being joined by Dr. Dean Radin, who is Chief Scientist at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, as well as Associate Distinguished Professor of Integral and Transpersonal Psychology at California Institute of Integral Studies. Originally trained as a concert violinist, he shifted into science, earned his bachelor's degree in electrical engineering, magna cum laude with honors in physics from the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, his master's in electrical engineering and his PhD in psychology from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. For a decade, Dr. Radin worked on various advanced R&D projects at AT&T Bell Laboratories, GTE Labs, and for 3 decades, he's been engaged in the fascinating area of research, really on the frontiers of consciousness. Before joining the staff at the Institute in 2001, he held appointments at Princeton, SRI International, and other academic and industrial facilities. He is the author or co-author of literally hundreds of scientific, technical, and popular articles, 4 dozen book chapters, and 4 best-selling books, including The Conscious Universe, Entangled Minds, Supernormal, and Real Magic. And his books have been translated into dozens of languages around the world. He has been a guest on numerous TV shows, written about in national and international publications, topic of films, 26 documentaries. The list goes on, but we're really lucky to have him today. Dr. Dean Radin, thank you so much for taking the time to come on our show today.
It's my pleasure.
I would love to start off, just by reading a little bit from the Institute's website. Ultimately, core research goal: deeper understanding of the true nature of reality. Through intensive research and groundbreaking experimentation, we explore the interconnection between personal inner space and the outer space of our shared reality, ultimately studying the fact that mind, consciousness are not separate things, but ultimately core elements of our reality. For those that are unaware of the Institute for Noetic Sciences and haven't been exposed to you, take a few minutes, if you would, just to walk us through a little bit more about your history and the background to the organization. I think that'd be a great way to get things started off.
Our institute was started by Edgar Mitchell, who was the 6th man on the moon. He was the lunar module pilot for Apollo 14. And as an astronaut, you can imagine that he was selected for exceptional skills as a pilot, but he also had a doctorate in aerospace engineering from MIT. And you would not expect that he would be interested in things like mysticism and psychic phenomena, but like a lot of people, he was. Mm-hmm. Unlike a lot of people, he wasn't that shy about telling people about this. And so this is yet another aspect of being an astronaut, that these are the best and the brightest, but also somewhat iconoclastic because they're willing to take risks of the type that many of us are not willing to do. So the way he puts it sometimes is that his initial career was to explore the outer limits of outer space, mm-hmm. which he did. And then on the way back to the Earth, he had a full-blown classical mystical experience, was intrigued by what that was because it was no longer just reading about these things, but having the experience himself. And since he was used to technology and science, he decided to form our institute to use the tools and techniques of science in order to study what was that. Like, people have been talking about these kinds of experiences of universal oneness mm-hmm. forever, and he experienced it, and other astronauts had experienced similar things, although they weren't quite as forthcoming about it as he was. But there's something even today that has been talked about as the overview effect of seeing the planet as a little fragile blue marble sitting out in the blackness of space. which gives you a very different perspective on things that are happening on Earth. Our daily news is basically completely provincial. It's all about politics and pandemics and whatever. From space, you don't see any of that. What you see is something that looks like a perfectly spherical, more or less, fragile object that's beautiful. And you don't see any borders. You don't see countries. You don't see much of what humans have done. And so you can see then by actually being up there and seeing the world the size of a marble and realizing that all of our history and all of our conflicts and all of our great inventions were produced by creatures on that planet, that we have a responsibility for that. We're the stewards of the planet at this point. We can screw it up or we can fix it. And so part of our mission also is to find out not only what is the role of consciousness in the physical world, but how is that important in terms of helping the world survive in a way that is not going to destroy it?
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned it was Edgar Mitchell and sort of taking risks, and the Institute has been at the forefront of taking these risks at the border of this area of science. And the one other thing I wanted to just point out to the audience, and you talk about for a couple of minutes as well, is along the way you. I don't know if you're one of the founders. I know you're on the board of the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Material Sciences. Folks like Julia Mossbridge, who have had on the show a couple of times, Gary Schwartz, Radin. I know you have, there's several hundred scientists now that have gotten involved in sort of this, once again, this integrated connection with consciousness with the rest of, the materialist mainstream. But just talk a little bit about what is happening on that front now in 2022. I know you formed the Academy back in 2018. How has that been moving along, sort of separately from Noetic Science Institute?
It's not completely separate. I mean, it's a separate organization, and we have colleagues around the world who are interested in similar things. It is addressing a rising interest among scientists in many disciplines who are beginning to realize that while materialism is extremely successful as a scientific doctrine, essentially a set of assumptions, that like a lot of theories and models that we have, it's really, really good in its domain, but it doesn't work outside of its domain very well. And so an example from physics is that classical physics worked really well. It got us essentially to the moon. Yep. But that's not all there is. There's relativistic physics, which is which is a more comprehensive way of thinking about reality, and quantum mechanics, which is even more comprehensive. So what we see again and again throughout every discipline in science is at some point people will say, okay, now we really got it. We got the theories, we understand fundamentally what's going on, until something else comes along and they say, oops, we have to expand our notion. We're not going to throw away what worked. We'll simply expand it, and we'll see what used to be considered to be fundamental as a special case. So materialism, as I see it, is a special case of what will eventually become a much more comprehensive philosophy, set of assumptions that will, among other things, include consciousness as a core component. So at the moment that you start entertaining those kinds of ideas, we're using words like post-materialism because we don't know what to call it yet. Right. You're saying there's something that's going to happen after our current somewhat constrained notion of what we mean by a set of assumptions that will expand, and we're currently calling it post-materialist.
And let's say, before we'll go into some of your work from the past year, but just one other thing I wanted to expose the audience to, your team. I mean, it's an extremely interdisciplinary group. You have there physicists, molecular biologists, neuroscience, psychologists. Talk a little bit about the organization from that perspective as well, just so people can get a read on sort of the convergent skill set that you guys bring together there.
One of the nice things about studying the nature of consciousness is that you need to know everything. Right? It's both challenging and annoying at the same time because nobody can know everything. So you're really forced to work in a multidisciplinary group to fill in gaps that no one person knows. And so we have complementary skills, we have similar interests, and we could probably expand by a factor of 5 to fill in other disciplines that should be part of what we're doing as too, and not just scientific disciplines. We need people from the humanities, we need philosophers, we need people who can represent basically every little chunk of knowledge that people can gain. And it's also always very useful to have people who are experts in those domains. So all of the folks in our team are coming out of traditional backgrounds, most of us with years or decades of traditional research in our own discipline. Mm-hmm. And that helps too, because then it means we know how big science works. We know what the game is, we know how to do publications, we're editors of journals and all that stuff. So we are able to swim within science as it is practiced by many disciplines, and we're able to use those tools to bring to bear to topics that are very wide interest, except it's not exactly permitted at this point within the academic world.
Mm-hmm. One of the areas that we've profiled a bit on the show over the last year, and this fits in really nicely with some of the work that you've been doing this year, is sort of this field of quantum biology and sort of the merging of the world of Einstein with the world of Schrodinger and very big with the very small, and ultimately the trend to sort of start to make some of these connections between what physically may be going on inside the skull here and the electrons and the spin chemistry and everything that really has been somewhat mysterious, but we're beginning to learn more and more at a deeper level. And with that, I would love to just start off one of your you published recently in the last year on this concept of whether a mental intention can ultimately influence this very important property in the quantum world of quantum entanglement. Your paper, Psychophysical Interactions with Entangled Photons, 5 exploratory experiments. Walk us through, if you would, just a little bit of what you're doing on this front, because it's clearly fascinating.
Well, this is part of a long series of studies which is looking at the parallels between psychic phenomena and quantum mechanics. Mm-hmm. And I don't say that quantum mechanics, as we currently understand it, explains consciousness or psychic phenomena. Mm-hmm. What I do is say that there's an interesting parallel in that the things that are considered strange about psychic phenomena is that they involve non-local connections mm-hmm. through space and time. They also involve something like an observer effect, that when people observe systems, the system changes. Well, this is the same that you find in quantum mechanics as well. There are two major differences between quantum and classical physics. So I've been interested in that connection and have been doing experiments and initially using double slit optical systems, partially because it's a very simple system, but also because if you can gain which path information in the apparatus, it will change the behavior of the photons. So we've been doing that, except rather than looking at it with your eye, we're having people look at it with their mind's eye to see if they can mentally gain information, which path information, and if they could, essentially through clairvoyance, then it should change the interference pattern. So we've done a bunch of experiments along those lines. The one involving entangled photons is taking yet another step, which is because entanglement seems to be so fundamental in terms of possibly being related to the fabric of space and time itself. In other words, that our concepts of space and time might emerge out of the phenomenon of entanglement. Mm-hmm. And very fundamental ideas like entropy seem to be related to quantum entanglement as well. So our question was twofold. First of all, since we have a fair amount of evidence in lots of different directions that mental intention seems to affect the probabilistic nature of reality, mm-hmm. It does that even in larger scale systems too, except it's not entirely clear. Actually, it's not clear at all what the mechanism is.
Sure.
It's a little bit easier to get at mechanism when you're working with elementary systems or with truly random numbers. But entanglement then, we wanted to know whether aspects of non-local mind interact with aspects of non-local matter. So virtually every experiment involving psychic phenomena you can think of is in terms of non-local mind. What can your mind do that is not just your brain in your head doing something, but something at a distance? Mm-hmm. So non-local matter, the only non-local matter that we can reliably use at this point is entangled photons. And there's apparatus. We bought one that produces about 1,000 entangled photons per second. And when you have that, you can prove that that these photons are entangled by using a method that was developed by Clauser, Horn, Shimoni, and Holt. It's the standard CHSH method that looks at coincidences in photons that have passed, like each one of the two photons in a pair passes through a polarizer, a different polarizer, and then you can count how correlated they are against what would happen if you put classical photons through two polarizers. So just to make one example, if you send photons through a vertical and a horizontally crossed polarizers and you look at coincidence counts, you're not going to get any because they won't both be able to pass through both of them. They're going to cancel themselves out. But with a quantum mechanical arrangement, the correlations between photons are stronger than classical correlations. And this is essentially what makes it quantum. It's behaving as though the photons know something about the other one, so the correlations are not simply that they started out through some similar properties, but they know, in quotes, what is happening to their partner. So that's this mysterious entanglement connection.
Yep.
So we wanted to see, could the mind modulate the strength of that connection, because it's on a spectrum. It goes from classical up to as high as you can get in quantum. And then, as I just said, that there is an upper limit to the degree to which entanglement can take place. The limit is named after this Russian mathematician called Boris Cyrulsin, who calculated, based on quantum mechanics, how strong could these entanglement correlations become. So it's known as the Cyrulsin bound. It's the upper bound.
Okay.
So we wanted to see, can we modulate entanglement? And if so, can we push it above the Cyrulsin bound? Because if we could, it would mean that quantum mechanics is incomplete. Because the mind is doing something that is not accommodated by orthodox quantum mechanics. Mm-hmm. So the first part of that experiment was, does the mind modulate the strength at all? And the answer appears to be yes. We got a significant result, both in laboratory studies and also in an online study, suggesting that mind can modulate entanglement strength to some degree. But we could not find evidence that we can push it beyond the Cyrulsin bound. Mm. Now, I think that may have more to do with the apparatus that we used, rather than a fundamental upper limit. And the reason is that the apparatus that we used was really good, but it's not the best that you can get. So we know that we're able at times to get like 15 sigma above classical. So we know that absolutely the entanglement strength that we were getting really was entangled to 15 or 14, 15 sigma above classical, but you need to be even beyond that in terms of entanglement fidelity in order to be able to see if you can push it above the Cyrulsin bound. So far, no one has done it. I mean, not mentally, but just experimentally in the laboratory. It's really difficult to get entanglement systems that have such high fidelity that they would exceed that bound. That's why at this point, I think many physicists would probably say they would be extremely surprised if anybody actually could exceed the Cyrulsin bound. So at least with current ideas about how quantum mechanics works.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Moving to slightly larger objects, you published the effects of intentionally treated water on the growth of mesenchymal stem cells. Here, I'd love you to talk about the experiment that you did here, but at the same time, when, once again, going back sort of the quantum theme as it pertains to biology, and I did my top line investigations into this area in the past with really esoteric topics like the crystallochemical structures of water and spin chemistry and things of this nature that are a little beyond my pay grade. But you mentioned before, a lot of this, obviously, we're only learning, or we have only putative ideas on mechanisms and so forth. But can you tell us a little bit of what you think is happening? It's not just with the stem cells themselves, but the water component of this work.
Well, we have done a couple of studies involving intentional and sometimes also unintentional changing of the structure of water. Mm-hmm. So one such study we did a large-scale clinical trial testing energy medicine. Okay. So we had, I forget if it was 17 or 19 different practitioners using different kinds of energy medicine methods like Reiki and therapeutic touch and lots of other methods. And then 190 clients, each of whom had carpal tunnel syndrome. Mm. And the clinical aspect was, does the energy medicine assist in the pain of carpal tunnel? And the answer there was absolutely yes, it did, to a highly statistically significant degree. But what we also did was we filled an aliquot of water. Okay. We put it on a necklace, and we had the healer wear it while healing, and also the client wearing these little aliquots of water. Okay. And before we gave it the necklace, we also took a drop and we did a before treatment and an after treatment spectrographic analysis. And we used a very sensitive method called attenuated total reflection Fourier transform infrared spectroscopy. Okay. So it uses a sensor that you have to cool down with liquid nitrogen. It uses special optics. The upshot of it is that you can tell what is happening to the molecular bonds in the water. So the before and after showed that we were getting a significant change in the structure of the stretching bond. Mm-hmm. There's like 6 different ways that the hydrogen and oxygen molecules can go together. Yep. So one's called stretching, and it's literally, if you imagine the hydrogen and oxygen, it's this stretch up and down, like, or sideways. So that changed significantly. Well, this was a replication of a study that was done like 20 years before, which used a similar design, similar methods, and so on. So we've apparently replicated this idea that something about the structure of water changes as a result of people doing at least highly focused mental work. In this case, it was a healing type of method. Okay. So we did another study involving water that was turned into tea. We made a big batch of oolong tea and then separated it into 2 pieces, one of which was then the target of intention by Buddhist monks who we know in Taiwan. Mm-hmm. And so I work with a colleague in Taiwan at a Buddhist temple in Taiwan. So we asked the monks, could you mentally imprint or bless or meditate upon this batch of oolong tea so that anybody who drank it would get an improvement in their mood? Mm-hmm. And we used a standard mood reporting scale over the course of a week and under double-blind conditions, people would get either the treated tea or the untreated tea, and then we'd look at their mood scales to see what happened. There's a bunch of covariates you need to watch as well, things like neuroticism that can modulate mood more. Mm-hmm. So we balanced all of the subjects in various different ways so that it'd be about as close to an even playing field as we could get. And the bottom line was people drinking the treated tea had better mood than the people not drinking the treated tea. So the next thing we said was, well, that's a subjective measure, which is interesting, but let's try an objective measure. So the first one that we did was Arabidopsis thaliana, which is a little plant, like a mustard plant. The reason we chose that is because my colleague has this idea that maybe what's going on is ultimately a quantum effect. And in order to test that, we should use a living system as the target. But a living system, like all living systems, has the protein called cryptochrome. So cryptochrome is an interesting protein because not only is it found in all living systems, but it appears to have quantum properties. And one of the ways that we think we know this is because the expression of cryptochrome is throughout the body. In birds, it is particularly strong in the retina. And so, and also in their magnetic sensory systems. So as we know, birds can navigate by paying attention to the magnetic fields of the earth. It's like a magnetic highway in the sky.
Yep.
And because they have cryptochrome in the eye, it is thought that they can actually see the lines of force. And so that it's almost literally like there's a highway in the sky, and they can follow that. And during a magnetic storm, when those lines get all distorted, the birds get lost because they're following a road that's no longer pointing in the right direction. So we used a cryptochrome mutation of Arabidopsis, where we now know words like gain of function. Because of COVID, people are all worried about that, but this is standard when you're doing any kind of genetics work. So there are mutations of the Arabidopsis plant which overexpress cryptochrome, gain of function on cryptochrome.
Sure.
And there's also underexpress, and then there's the wild type. So we tried all different types with the idea that maybe the Arabidopsis that was especially sensitive to cryptochrome effects, and mainly the way it responds to blue light, maybe that would show a bigger effect in terms of growth. So we had the Buddhist monks charge or imprint water that anything grown in this would grow better. And then we had identical water from the same source, send it over to a plant physiologist who grew it from seeds, double blind, not knowing which water was which. And then at the end, measured several different kinds of measures. One's called the Hypocotyl, which is the top of the seed to, well, the top of the roots to the bottom of where the first leaves are. So that little section, the Hypocotyl, is usually the part that you see poking above the dirt up to the leaves. And a healthy plant has a short, fat hypocotyl, because when you think about the seed, it contains a certain amount of energy. And if that energy is depleted, it's not going to take. So the less energy that the seed needs to use in order to get the plant up and unfold the leaves and all that, the healthier it is. So our prediction was that the plants that were treated with the blessed water would have a short, fat hypocotyl as compared to the others that got the control water. And that's what we found, highly statistically significant effect. And we repeated the test 9 times because the effect was so strong that we weren't sure that we believed it. But nevertheless, that seemed to be what happened. It responded quite well. And in particularly in the gain of function mutation of cryptochrome. So, well, not of cryptochrome, but of the plant that had overexpression of cryptochrome. So then we decided to do a next step, which was another system that has cryptochrome, but also is exquisitely sensitive, namely stem cells.
Yep. So
stem cells are interesting because they can turn into anything that you want. They seem to be highly reactive. And so we got adult stem cells from dental pulp. You can grow stem cells from there. And we're interested in a number of things, primarily in proliferation. So adult stem cells are more difficult to proliferate, to grow in medium than other kinds, especially embryonic stem cells. So we created media, growth media out of water, which had been imprinted by the Buddhist monks versus the control. And the bottom line was, again, using double-blind methods throughout, more proliferation of the stem cells. And then we did various kinds of genetic tests to see if we could see why they had changed, what had changed. And we found a number of indicators suggesting that the stem cells not only grew more, but they're actually healthier. Their property of stemness was better than the ones that were just grown in ordinary water in the growth medium.
Very fascinating. Really fascinating. Dean, in addition to everything you're doing at the Institute of Noetic Sciences, and obviously you're teaching. You're also now a co-founder of a biotech company called
Cognigenics.
Cognigenics, yeah, here it is. And, working here in some really fascinating area. It sounds like you're involved in CRISPR and RNA editing, areas of anxiety, depression, dementia. You have a lot on your plate, but talk a little bit about, if you would, sort of some of what the plans are for the new company. And then also know, separately from that, or maybe it's connected, but you could, in the past, you have done some work in the area of genetics of PSI. Are these related, or is there some overlap there? Or is this a totally separate? I'd like to hear about both initiatives, but tell us a little bit about what's going on, if you would.
Well, it is related. So,
okay.
By the way, there is no PSI. The word is psi, right? It's a letter in the Greek alphabet, the first letter of the word psyche. That's all it is, psi. So, yes, we're interested in the genetics of psychic ability. Mm-hmm. We surveyed 3,000 people around the world to find people who said they were psychic from families that were also psychic, and every culture in the world has these legends. And we figured then that, well, maybe there's a genetic component of a special talent mm-hmm. for these folks. And so we had only enough money to get around 20 cases where we vetted that people were probably talented psychically and came from psychic families mm-hmm. and were willing to give us their DNA through a saliva sample, and then match controls. That is complete the opposite as much as we can get. And we found a difference, not in the exome sequence, which was a little surprising, but only in the intron sequence. So it's a part of the DNA that used to be called junk DNA because they didn't know what it did. Well, it seems to be involved in things like epigenetic switching and that sort of thing. So this is part of a much longer term project to look at genetics and morphological differences and things that we had started to do years ago, decades ago, to find out why are some people talented in this domain and others are not. And so there are a lot of personality tests. Back when the US government was doing this stuff, they did MRIs, they did every test you could think of, every physiological difference, psychological. They never could really find other than that somebody was in a creative profession. But even that wasn't enough. You look at some of the best remote viewers that we have were people whose lives depended on their intuition being exceptionally good. Well, they weren't necessarily creative in an artistic sense, so they didn't match that, but there's something different. One piece underneath it is, again, that other people in the family seem to have similar abilities. They don't always express the same way, but something like that. So there seems to be a genetic component. The moment that there is, if indeed there is, it suggests that we can enhance or suppress those abilities. So on the enhancement side, it would be very nice if we were able to identify people who are naturally talented, could be trained, and would be an amazing resource, especially in a world faced with all kinds of very complicated problems. If you had any heads up at all about, of these 25 different things that we could do, which one will end up being better, like a precognitive ability, well, that would be invaluable. I mean, so there's many, many applications here where it would be useful to have something which is sort of in alignment with the Philip K. Dick movie and book, Minority Report.
Yep.
Right? Use of precogs. For a long time, my license plate, I had the word precog, no longer that. But to have people who are trained and cultivated and supported for having these special abilities. That's probably going on sub rosa anyway, but we're talking here about not only identifying people, but then being able to enhance their ability. All kinds of ethical issues immediately arise. The easy one to explain is the Star Trek episode, The Wrath of Khan.
Yep.
So, and then when we started talking about enhancing humans in any way, of course, there's a problem there. And we recognize that, and we're still we're still interested in whether or not we should do this or not, and probably in RNA. So it wouldn't be a permanent change. It would be only DNA, or sorry, the other way around. It would do it in RNA to not make it permanent, so it would not be a DNA effect. So we have ideas about how to do that. And so in the process of thinking about all that, in talking to my other co-founder of Cognigenics, we realized that in a sense, you need to solve a whole bunch of problems before you can even begin to think about doing this sort of thing. And one of them is, first of all, you choose something which is a lot simpler than a genetic trait, which probably includes hundreds, if not thousands, of interacting genes. Yeah. So if you look at a relatively subtle cognitive difference like intelligence, there's studies showing that intelligence that's called crystalline versus flexible. So crystalline intelligence is somebody who's extremely good at analytical thought and all that sort of thing. And fluid intelligence is somebody who is extremely good at creativity. In the classic IQ test, they might show themselves to be about the same, but the way that their intelligence expresses is in very different directions. That is associated with constellations of hundreds of genes. And we kind of suspect that the same is going to be the case here because we're talking about a relatively subtle mental or cognitive ability. Mm. So we wanted to start simple with something that would, and this, by the way, is across the board in companies that are using CRISPR and genetic editing to attack things like cystic fibrosis, which is one or a few genes, and sickle cell anemia. And now people are beginning to look at things like neurodegenerative problems like Parkinson's and those kinds of CNS problems, mostly in the brain. Those are relatively easy because you can identify the gene that is the cause. You can edit it and fix it. And the early studies of things like certain genetic diseases of, well, sickle cell is one example, another is a liver disease. These are all based on usually single genes that have written incorrectly. You can correct it, and it is a permanent change. It's like a permanent cure of these diseases. So it is definitely going to be part of the medical equipment in the future where you can identify something which is not too difficult to fix, and you do an IV drip and you saturate the body with it, and then you're a different person. So is that an ethical issue? Well, yeah, it's part of the slippery slope, but not too much more than, or should we be doing transplants of organs? Yeah. Should we give somebody an artificial limb? You know, all of these kinds of questions have always come up every time there's an advancement in medicine. This one's a little bit different because you're literally changing the physical makeup of somebody at this point. But if it solves a disease, like we think, we originally started with the idea that we could attack Alzheimer's. It's a very slow moving target. It does involve some genetics. We can edit those, but it might take 30 years to find out if it worked. So we decided to do something that is relatively simple, which is anxiety and depression, because the underlying mechanism of action is reasonably well understood. It's complicated, but it's understood to some degree. So we wanted to find a way of using CRISPR to edit portions of the brain, and in particular certain neuronal receptors, to downregulate serotonin uptake. And the reason is, if you look at how do current drugs do this? Well, an SSRI drug will go into the brain and it will eventually cause the brain to become supersaturated with too much serotonin. And the brain doesn't like that because you get overexcited, and it will downregulate 5-HT2A neuronal receptors. It's more complicated than that, but that's the essential way that it's working. The same is true, by the way, with psychedelics. So psychedelics are being used for anxiety and depression. It's affecting the serotonin system and ultimately downregulating 5-HT2A. So we thought, okay, what if we could just downregulate those receptors directly, not indirectly, which is the method that pharma is currently using, and psychedelics, but just go in and actually revise the way that these receptors work so that they don't uptake so much serotonin. Would that work? Well, it turns out it does. The second part of what we needed to do was we needed to find a way of having this delivered non-invasively, because the current method is to inject a 6-inch needle directly into your brain, or to do it through IV, or to inject it in the cerebral spinal fluid. We don't want to do that, because if we're dealing with some kind of a psychiatric treatment, you don't want to create more trauma in the process of giving it treatment unless it's absolutely horribly severe.
Yep.
So we're talking still about chronic cases of anxiety and depression, which are resistant to other kinds of drugs, where we can directly affect the mechanism that we want. And so we've done tests now in mice. We have a number of tests. We're looking at behavioral changes, so we can show highly statistically significant decreases in anxiety. And we also can do the immunohistochemistry to see whether or not the neurons that we're aiming to influence are in fact being influenced and nothing else is being influenced. Because the moment you start doing genetic editing, there's always the potential of off-target editing, which you don't want. That would be a bad side effect. So we use a method which targets only neurons, and which among other things means it becomes much safer because it's not affecting anything else. So it only affects the neurons, and it only will edit certain kinds of neurons, which are these receptors that we want to edit. And so if you look at the staining that you get with the brain slices in the mice, you can see that is doing exactly what we planned it to do. So the state of the art now in genetic engineering is way better than it was when it first started 20 or 30 years ago. And the precision of editing now is getting better and better almost day by day. So we decided to use an old-fashioned version of CRISPR, which is 2 years old, because so many new methods have come along that are smaller molecules, more precise editing methods that will do error correction, all kinds of things. But if we figure we can show it using the original form of CRISPR, all that's going to happen later is it'll get better. So when you look at the efficacy of what we have at this point, you look at pharma methods and you look for psychedelic methods like ketamine and so on. So there's this bar chart showing the effectiveness. In our first shot, we're right in the middle. So we're better than SSRIs. We're about the same. Some SSRIs are better than ours, but we're in the middle of SSRIs and psychedelics with a method that we think is, we have evidence that is directly affecting the neuronal receptors that we want to affect. So that gives us some hope at this point that the platform that we've created will have application for psychiatry, because other targets that we can go to are things like OCD. Depression and anxiety are closely related to each other, but also migraine has a genetic basis to it. And all of that, everything I've just said, is a precursor to what we really want to do, which is cognitive enhancement, both in terms of psychic ability, intuitive ability, memory, all of the things that we saw in the movie Limitless. You take a pill, in our case, it won't be a pill, but you take something and you would be significantly enhanced. And that, of course, opens a huge door of ethical considerations, which we're paying attention to. We know that this is already happening. People are engaged in this. And so it puts us in that strange position where any scientist is always going to be on, is it better to know or not to know? Where do you draw the line on what should be studied? And the problem is that we know how to do this. We know what's taking place. Should we just ignore it and not figure out how to use it? Or do you engage bioethicists along with what you're doing to try to constrain how this is going to be used? Which is a little bit difficult now because, a high school student can buy a CRISPR box at this point and start doing anything they want.
Right.
So the Pandora's box is already opened here, and we figure let's see how we can use this in a beneficial way, and pay attention to the ethical considerations at the same time.
Yeah, and then you have a very active, not just biohacking community out there now, but a neurohacking community. So yeah, it's gonna be some interesting time. And I think you're at a really sweet spot for it all. And it's, yeah, as I said, it was fascinating to see that you've become biotech entrepreneur alongside everything else you're doing. So it's really cool. Talking about some of these therapeutic targets for a minute, things like stress and anxiety and depression, obviously been on the rise substantially, especially the last couple of years throughout the pandemic. Just coming back to the noetic sciences for a moment, and a lot of obviously the sort of the core theme of the interconnectedness and some of the, a lot of the work that you've been doing over the years in collective consciousness studies. Any top line findings in general about how, I guess, I don't know if I'm putting this the right way, the collective consciousness has shifted one way or another during these last 2 very rough years with all of these mental situations going in all different directions, and any interesting institute findings that we should know about that we need to focus on for moving society back one way or another.
Because we're in unprecedented modern times, yeah. There have certainly been pandemics in the past. Yep. And the world is so interconnected now, and there's so many ways for people to become confused about what they should or shouldn't do. I mean, it's distressing from the point of view of knowing a lot of people in the medical world who are basically tearing their hair out. I don't have that much hair left to tear out, so it doesn't matter so much. But I have lots of friends in the medical world who are quite disturbed about the degree of misinformation that is preventing people from saving themselves, essentially. Yes, mRNA vaccines are relatively new, but in many ways they're a lot safer than previous versions of vaccines because they're RNA and they tell the body what to do, and the body is very good at creating new proteins and yep. antibodies. So there's you see this the same kind of thing within GMO food. There's a suspicion that why are you changing the natural world? Well, sorry, but the natural world is allowing us to do this, where it is not alien technology. We figured out how things work, and we're able to make it better. Is it always going to be better? Well, no. So I met one time the inventor of trans fats, who was supposed to be like this giant breakthrough, which was going to help everybody not become overweight by using these other kinds of fats, which turned out to be really, really bad. And he said that, well, that was a mistake. He thought I was doing something pretty good. Oops. Yeah, there was an oops. And the oopses are going to happen again and again because we don't know everything about everything. So will a genetically modified carrot actually end up killing us in 30 years? I don't think so. I mean, we understand enough about what carrots do that we can add more vitamin D to it and things like that, and it's probably okay. For other things, though, some of the genetic methods being used for medical treatment now, at least within the short term, last couple of years, they're doing amazingly well. We don't know what happens in 30 years. We're only beginning to find out that if you get COVID, that there's going to be consequences on that too. So, life is risky. And now I completely forgot what your question was because
coming back to the collective consciousness theme of the Institute.
Yeah. So since March of 2020, our laboratory has been shut. So we haven't been able to do any studies in the lab. Mostly what we're doing now are either catching up on analyses and other work that we didn't have time to do before. We have done a couple of in-person tests that were done in hotels where we're able to rent space, but the facilities, our own facilities, actually have been shut down since March of 2020. So the only project then that has been nominally tracking the collective mind or consciousness is the Global Consciousness Project, which started in 1998. And so that is still going. Part of one of my projects now is I'm engaged in an analysis of those data. We have 23 years of data from random number generators that have been running continuously since August of 1998 to the present day. And we're also developing what we call GCP 2.0, which is the next generation of this global consciousness project. The version 1 at its peak had about 75 random generators running around the world in different locations. And we look for correlations between large-scale world events that attract a lot of attention, like the opening ceremony of the Olympics or terrorist attacks, things like that,
yep,
as compared to the degree of randomness that we're seeing in our worldwide network. And so that formal experiment went from 98 to 2015, when 500 events had been identified and tracked. So these are events that are either predicted, like a big meditation is going to happen, or a funeral of a celebrity or something. And then unpredicted events like earthquakes and tsunamis and things of that sort. So the method is, this data is streaming in all the time. We identify an event of interest, and then we look at the data using a formalized method. And that shows a 7 sigma deviation from chance. What that means is that we're seeing less random behavior in the random generators around the world during these large-scale events where we infer that a lot of attention is being paid on the same thing at the same time. That is the suggestion, even though all we see is a correlation, it's a suggestion that are the generators doing this on their own? We don't think so. The thing that looks like it's pushing it is large-scale attention by millions of people. So it looks causal. It may not be causal, though. And the reason why this other interpretation comes up is that somebody had to make a decision about which events we're going to look at. So between 1998 and 2015, thousands of things are happening all the time. There are all kinds of groups around the world doing meditations. There's Chinese New Year's, which we forgot. There's all kinds of events that probably produced effects, if our hypothesis is correct, but we didn't select them. So you think of the output of the Global Consciousness Project as a kind of a random walk. It is a random walk. It's truly random numbers being generated continuously. So the selection hypothesis says somehow the experimenters who are selecting events to look at somehow knew that this one was going to correlate with a deviation of the random walk in a positive direction. And so if you could kind of sort of step back from this world into a block universe and see the whole thing laid out in front of you, you will see points where it's going to deviate positive. And so you kind of wait around and wait. So, okay, this event feels really good to me. Like this is going to show a difference. Well, yeah, because that's the one that in the future is going to end up deviating from chance. So it's still anomalous. It requires something like precognition, but it's very different interpretation because now it's not the world pushing the randomness. It's the experimenters who are really good at guessing which events to select. So the selection hypothesis. So one of the ways of then addressing this issue of, are we talking about a causal effect of many minds? Or are we talking about a selection based on only experimenters? Is to look at the rest of the database that is not those 500 events.
Okay.
So the 500 events represent roughly 4% of our database. So we have 96% of the data, which is just random data just pouring into this gigantic database. And so I decided to come up with a way to analyze the rest of the data to see whether we're dealing with just a normal random walk or with something more peculiar than that, something that is not quite random. And this is harking back a little bit to Einstein's complaint about quantum mechanics that God does not play dice with the universe, right? He wanted some kind of causation underneath it rather than pure randomness. So I developed a method that does show that days that had not been looked at previously, when selected based on deviations in it. In other words, if you look at the random walk over time and you select points where there are these spikes of unusual activity, is the data around that time behaving in an expected random way or not? The answer is not. It's behaving in a way that looks like there's an autocorrelation that has arisen. Well, it shouldn't. There shouldn't be any autocorrelation. We even checked it to make sure that these are truly random numbers that are independent of each other. But nevertheless, they're showing that a dependency arises. So when I was talking to this with colleagues, they said, oh, well, there's another method you could use called multi-scale entropy, which is also designed to look for periods. It's designed to look for a complex structure in sequences. Mainly has been used so far for physiological sequences like analysis of EEG. And it turns out to be extremely powerful because you're able to look at multiple time scales and to look for complexity at each one of those scales. So, for example, if you take the EEG of people at different ages, you see very clearly that there are differences in the degree of EEG complexity depending on age.
Okay.
It starts out relatively simple. Like a baby's brain is simple in the sense that there's a huge number of neurons, but the EEG that is produced by it is not very complex. The older you get, the more complex the EEG becomes, and this method can see that. And then as you get much older and you begin to decline, you begin to revert back in the direction of a baby. It becomes less and less complex. So I've applied that same technique to the data from the GCP, and sure enough, it shows that the data coming out of there as compared to a surrogate, which is the same data just randomly scrambled, you get a highly significant negentropic effect in the actual data.
Okay.
Right? So remember, we're dealing with random numbers, which are checked to make sure that they're independent of each other. There's no dependencies at all. The GCP data, as it is recorded, is showing dependencies. And if you take as a control then exactly the same data, except that you scramble the order of the data to destroy any possible dependencies, well, then everything looks totally as you would expect by chance. That is not the case for the data that we're actually recording. So what this says is that in this 23-year-long database, and you look on the data that's coming out of the thing, it does have a suggestion that what looks like a random sequence is actually getting pushed around by innumerable groups doing various kinds of intentional work or attentional work. You still can't prove it at this point. The closest that we got is a colleague who correlated to a highly statistically significant degree movements in the stock market versus movements in the Global Consciousness Project, because the stock market is a reflection of emotion and other things happening worldwide. And it turns out there's a correlation there. So GCP2 will have a minimum of 1,000 of these generators around the world. More complex methods of producing the data, much more complex website and so on. It will also allow us then to use that system, the worldwide system, as a target of intention. So we have lots of meditation groups saying, oh, we're doing this meditation. Can we target your system and see if it does anything? Well, our response to date is no, because this is a passive monitoring system. It's not designed to be an active target, but the new version will have that as a capability as well, without messing up the monitoring capability, because each node actually is going to have many random generators in it, and we can assign some of them to be the targets, and other ones will remain passive, essentially, as observers. So to answer your question, we don't know what has happened over the last couple of years, because if we're looking at very long-term trends, because we're talking about trends over years, you need data that spans years before, during, and after. And so we don't know at this point what's going to happen. I kind of suspect that we will see definitely something happening, except that keep in mind that the way that this experiment works is it makes an inference that you need mental coherence. You need minds aligned in the same direction. And the metaphor I use is, if you want to detect a tsunami in the ocean, you put thousands of buoys out in the ocean and you measure their movements. Most of the time, the movements are all random. A tsunami is a giant wave in the ocean. So if you're measuring movements, you see suddenly buoys thousands of miles apart have correlated their behavior. They're going up and down, maybe pointing in the same direction. That's what we do with the GCP. We're using an ocean of consciousness, but the random number generators are floating in that ocean. And when all these minds become aligned, it's a little bit like a wave arises. And in this case, the reason why the wave arises in the physical world is because of an underlying assumption that reality in some way is like dual aspect monism, that it's fundamentally physical, but it's also fundamentally consciousness, and they interact in a very intimate way.
Yep.
So when a bunch of minds start doing something unusual, matter will respond in the same way. You just need to look at what kind of matter and be monitoring it long enough to be able to see that the changes actually occurred.
Yep. I love the tsunami analogy too. That's puts a nice mental picture around it all. It's really fascinating work, Dean. While I have you, Happy New Year. What's big things happening in 2022? I mean, obviously we'll be emerging out of this situation, but things coming up that we should know about, other new projects that you might want to mention at this point. Please take the floor for the wrap up.
Well, each of us have a number of projects underway at any given time. I'm a little superstitious about explaining what I'm currently working on. Not so much that somebody's going to steal the idea, but at least within the domain of working on psychic phenomena, you want to maintain a clean test tube.
Sure.
And so you don't want interfering attention and intention until you're ready to talk about it.
Got it.
One thing I can mention is that another long-term experiment that I started in 2000 was the website called gotsci.org. Okay. It was based on this idea, I got milk. Well, this is gotsci. So it is a suite of different kinds of simple psychic tests, all of which are valid. And we've spent a good part of the last year bringing it up to date. Because I wrote it in 2000 using Perl and using the methods that were mainstream then. And it's worked really well. I mean, we have almost 20 years of data for 250 million trials that have been contributed by 300,000 people. It's a huge database, and we're still analyzing it. But we've changed it to this newer version, which is using modern methods for security, for speed, full database in the background, a whole bunch of other things like that, which will have the same kind of games on them, or little psi tests. So we'll be able to compare it with the previous 20 years, but with modern computing methods. Because among other things, every time we do anything online, you immediately see people trying to hack it.
Yeah.
They're trying to get into your server. They're trying to fake data. It's like constant number of people out there have nothing better to do than to try to break your system. So there's a huge overhead then that we have to take care of.
Sure.
In doing something to be able to vet real data versus fake data.
Well, yeah, I mean, you wish those people had something better to do, but no, it's fascinating. I mean, it's always fascinating following what you're doing, Dean, and really wishing you the best on all this. And obviously, as we come out of the pandemic, hopefully your team gets up and going and gets back full speed on all these amazing initiatives. But really, really fascinating set of work. For everybody that is going to be listening to this episode on our podcasts or watching the YouTube channel, you've been listening to Dr. Dean Radin, Chief Scientist, Institute of Noetic Sciences, Associated Distinguished Professor of Integral and Transpersonal Psychology, California Institute of Integral Studies, now co-founder of Cognigenics. Check out gotsci.org and all these fascinating psychic tests. Of course, pick up his books, The Conscious Universe, Entangled Minds, Supernormal, and Real Magic. Dean, thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule to come talk to us. Thanks for everything you're doing and continue to do there. And as we say on this show, thanks for helping to create a better tomorrow through everything you've been developing. Really, really fascinating story.
Thank you.